Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of The Car Guy on PeoriaLife.com. My name is Greg McCoy. I'm here with Brett Beachler. How you doing, Brett?
Good morning, Greg. I'm doing absolutely great.
It's a beautiful day to be alive.
It is. It is.
A little bit of rain out there.
Yes.
So today in this segment, you're going to talk about some critical parts for our cars.
Yeah, I want to. I've had this kind of desire to take people through some of the parts on cars because one of the things that I see is people love to touch and feel things. And this is probably as close as you can get other than coming into your shop and asking them to see parts and explain the capacity, what they're all about. The other desire I had was I see a lot of, receive a lot of calls where people call in and I've got brake parts over here, I'll show you. And they say, hey, how much for brakes? And I want to explain why it's difficult to give these estimates over the phone if they don't have another legitimate shop that's giving them an accurate estimate. That makes sense. So one of the arenas I'll start in is, this is what they call a fuel filter, and I'll take it out of the box and show everybody. But a lot of the newer cars are actually equipped with fuel filters inside the fuel tank. So you don't have to replace these on the basis that we used to. It used to be every 30,000 miles, you'd replace these particular filters. The main reason for replacement at that mileage interval is because it's kind of like having a heart attack. If this thing becomes, when this thing, not if, when it becomes restricted with debris from the tank to the engine, it clogs up, and then there's about a $500 fuel pump behind that. So this is why we encourage folks, hey, if your owner's manual states to do this, just do it because it's much less expensive to replace this component than it is the fuel pump itself. $55 versus $500.
Now, fuel filters used to be outside the fuel tank.
Yeah, they used to be underneath the hood. They were really tiny, probably a tenth of this size. You replace them every 5 or 10,000 miles. And then they went to these sizes. They're actually about this big now. They went to these sizes. They're under the belly of the vehicle on many of the older vehicles. But now they're inside the fuel tank.
Why did they do that?
The fuel pumps are made much, much better. These things are really massive inside the fuel tank. So the idea behind it is you don't have the expense of replacing this every 30,000 miles, as opposed to you replace the fuel filter when the fuel pump fails, which anymore we see you get 150,000, 200,000 miles out of fuel pumps. So it's just not necessarily the way it used to be. So I'm one of these guys that I embrace technology. I think it's great. I love having cars that you can, at the drop of a hat, have 250,000 miles on a car and go take a trip. Doesn't bother me in the least bit. So
they're in the fuel tank, and that's why you should never run but typically shouldn't run your fuel tank down below a quarter of a tank.
Well, the fuel pump is cooled by the fuel inside the fuel tank.
That's fuel pump.
Yep, the fuel pump is cooled, not the fuel filter. That has no effect on it. So, all right, so that's one component. Here's another component we deal with often, obviously, because we have a 3-bay operation that has oil changes. This is what they call a Mobil 1 extended performance filter. So your car has Mobil 1 oil that we use in it. So we put this filter on. It's about 30% more dense, much better filtering abilities and particulates inside of it. It allows the oil to go 10,000 miles. It's pretty key ingredient to allowing that oil to go 10,000 miles. I wish I had a cutout to where you could see the inside of this, but I do not. You just have to go on my word that it's a much better piece of equipment than a standard oil filter that goes on a car that lasts about 5,000 miles.
So there's a big difference between this and what you might buy at Walmart for somebody that wants to change their own oil.
That is correct. It's just a better quality filter, period. And a lot of this is in the filter itself. A lot of oil changes and extended life oil changes are in the filter and the oil itself and the engine technology. So anyway, that's what goes on with the oil filter. That's a filter that we put on daily for folks that are running 10,000 miles on oil changes. Okay, so I'll kind of move this stuff out of the way so we can see everything. So this is a spark plug. Replace these. We're doing spark plug replacements every day. However, it's not like it used to be. You cannot see the tip on this thing, but it's a very fine tip on it. It used to be a copper tip. It lasts 30,000 miles. They have now moved into platinum and iridium substances inside there. They allow them to go 100 to 120,000 miles.
That's amazing.
So it is amazing, and it's completely legitimate, and it's often we're replacing these things, and you can hardly tell the wear on them. That's what's amazing about these iridium tips. So embrace technology. It's out there. Most cars are equipped with these types of spark plugs anymore. It's very rare that you see cars that require spark plug replacements every 30,000 miles.
Now, for somebody who wants to do their own spark plug replacement,
Sure.
do they come gapped? Or you just have to gap them?
Good quality spark plugs come gap, but you still should check the gap. And what Greg is speaking of is there's a gap, if you can see that, in between this little device that's got a little 90-degree turn in it and the point itself. It's got to be a certain distance in between the iridium point and the node here. So sometimes they get bumped around, but this one's got a little sleeve that protects it. So they set the gap at the factory, and then we just put it in from there, but we always check gaps. That's standard procedure. Any good tech should be checking gaps on things. So, all right. So here is what they call a cabin air filter. So basically it's much like your filter for your furnace at home. There's a filter that protects the air between the outside and the inside of the car. It picks up any debris. They actually make these things in charcoal for people with allergies that help filter out more particulates in the air that get inside yourself and cause all kinds of things with allergies. I don't have it, so.
Are those way more expensive?
They're not too terribly more expensive. Typically, you see them $10 to $15 more, so it's not bad. Most cars you replace every 30,000 miles. But you do see some cars, their owner's manual are a little aggressive. They say 7,500 to 12,000 miles. But what we teach our customers, it's really about it's where you park your car. You know, Greg, if you were to park your car underneath a tree every day when you come home, then yeah, the 10,000 miles is probably what you want to do. But mostly people that park out in the open that don't get debris inside their car or in the cowl area, which is in between the windshield and the hood, they generally can go 30,000 miles. So it's a little bit overzealous in the industry on these things. But its job is to protect an evaporator core, which is about a $1,000 piece of equipment. So that's why the manufacturers brought these into play back in the 90s, is we were replacing evaporator cores on cars almost on a weekly basis. And the engineers finally got together and said, okay, what can we do to protect these things to keep what happens is debris gets down inside the evaporator core housing, and it sits there and molds, and next thing you know, this aluminum piece of equipment is gone and you don't have air conditioning anymore and it's leaking. So they put their heads together and said, let's put this inside. But with that said, you got to change this. But it's a whole lot better changing a filter for $20, $30, $40 than it is to replace an evaporator.
Where is the air intake for that?
The air intake
typically
is up in the cowl area. That's typically where it comes from. If you ever look at the top of your hood, there's an opening in the hood or there's a black cowl area, but that's typically where the air intake comes from.
Between the windshield and the hood.
Exactly. So anyway, cabin air filter for the engine is much the same. Filtrates the air going into the engine. Believe it or not, on an air filter, the failure test on that is if you cannot see fluorescent light behind the air filter of an engine air filter, it's time to replace it. So
now, I think we talked about this before, but in terms of replacing it, can you blow it out and clean it and put it back in, or do you have to just replace
you can, but what happens is the debris gets down inside the vents, and if that's where it's embedded and you're not able to blow it out with compressed air, then it's time to replace it. So most air filters for engines, you get 30,000. Some even go 50,000 miles. It all depends on what you drive through. So, So let's get to the arena that's kind of fun to talk about, the brake arena. You know, we get calls daily. I was telling Greg before the show, we get calls daily on, hey, how much to replace brakes? How do I do this? You know, what goes on? Tell me what's happening. So we kind of get into education mode on the brakes, and we say, look, the bottom line is we need to measure these things, both the brake pads and the brake rotors. So here's a pad, much like your bicycle brake system, okay? Here's your pad. Most pads have wear sensors on them. This particular pad does not have a wear sensor, which basically what that means is when it starts squealing, you're getting about time to replace the brake pads. Not all of them have it. So you've got a pad and you've got a backing plate, okay, that goes on with the pads. Just like your bicycle brake system, when it compresses down into a rotor. I'll show you here in just a minute. And I've told people this hundreds of times, but the harder you like to brake, the faster that little pad wears out, front and rear. So people always ask me the magic question, how long do brakes last? And I say, well, let's go for a ride. I can tell by your driving habits if they're going to last 30,000 miles, 50, 75 or 100,000 miles, if this is how they consistently break. So you've got, this is a new pad, okay? These two are used pads. This basically, if I don't know if you can see this on film, but basically what has gone on is this person got their money's worth out of their pads, and this is what we call it. If you can see that little shiny spot on the pad, that is the backing plate. Okay, the material is completely gone. And this person likely, and I'll show you the rotor that this went into, this person likely just ignored the brake sensor, wear sensor, and just kept on trucking. Okay. And I'll explain to you, it's not terrible, not necessarily a bad thing anymore because of rotors and how they're made, and they're not made as beefy as they used to be because manufacturers are trying to save weight. Okay, so here's another pad. This one's got a brake sensor on it right here, and basically what this person did is they heard the brake sensor, came in and got their pads checked out. It looks pretty small. That's actually a rear pad. You need less of a pad on the rear position than you do the front. Okay. Any good shop's going to put brake shims in. This basically keeps the brake pad from clunking around inside the caliper. It's, imagine your muscle trying to move and there's excessive movement where the tendons work. This is the same thing. This is just a shim that keeps it in place and secure, and it doesn't cause any brake noises. These things are pretty well worn when they came in, and they come in, you got to dispose of the old ones and put new ones in. Okay, so here's the fun part. Let's get into this. This is a worn brake rotor. Okay, I'll try to keep this desk as clean as possible. So it doesn't look too bad on this side if everybody can see. That's a fairly worn brake rotor. You can't really see the grooves in it, but there's some grooves. But here's what happened is this person had this brake pad and they wore it down so much that the brake pad, if you guys can see that, actually started grinding metal into metal. Okay, that's probably too far to go. What happens is there's a skeletal muscle system called the caliper, and if this thing completely wears out, you end up taking a $150 caliper out. So totally unnecessary. You don't need to do that. But this is what they call a worn brake rotor. Okay, a little rusty, but you got to remember it's seen all kinds of conditions. People get a little worked up over that stuff, but it is what it is. It doesn't look as pretty as this one. So this is the new rotor that would go on the car, nice and shiny, and they actually put a coat of oil on it. Any good brake rotor manufacturer is going to put a coat of oil on their brake rotor before they put it inside the plastic bag because they don't want it to rust while sitting in storage waiting to be put on a car down the road. Okay, so you mind opening that up? Okay, so this is where the trick comes in. When people call into our business and they say, hey, how much for brakes? And we go, okay, well, we need to know a little bit more. Because these brake pads, we either give people brake percentages or however many millimeters left. The one thing you got to watch out for in the industry, people will say 3 millimeters is time to replace your brakes. This is probably the thickness of 8 or 9 millimeters. Okay, 3 millimeters is literally about 30% material left. We don't do anything until you get down to about 10% or less. So the reason I tell people that is there's some overzealousy in the industry. People will say when they get down to 2 and 3, oh gosh, there's time to replace your brakes. 2 millimeters to the human brain doesn't sound like very much, but to a brake pad that starts out with 9 millimeters, it's actually quite a bit of material. So it's okay for shops to give millimeters. We don't mind that at all, but typically you don't replace them until you get down to 1 or 2 millimeters. That's just the industry standard. So that's one measurement, okay? So we don't know what we're dealing with. We don't know if we're dealing with an overzealous shop when that customer calls in and says, hey, somebody else said I need brakes. I had one the other day that said they need brakes, and they were literally the percentage was 20%, which we don't recommend until you get down to 10% or less. And that's why I say, sure, we're not the least expensive in town, but you're able to stretch your dollar further if somebody is measuring these things properly. Okay. Any questions so far, Greg?
Do you turn rotors anymore? Or you just replace them?
You can. And the technical term is called resurfacing. You're putting a brand new surface on the rotor. The perfect way to do it is to have an on-the-car brake lathe. Most good shops have this, where they connect to the hub of the vehicle, and they turn the rotor. You just caught me. They resurface the rotor. The proper terminology is resurface. You're putting a new surface on that rotor. So the good thing about the on-the-car brake lathe is it's picking up the intricacies of the brake hub assembly itself. So it's a perfect resurfacing job on the rotor. However, here's the catch. Most cars anymore are built with very small rotors, and they only last about 1 brakes. So we got to pitch them. And how we know to pitch them is this is what we call a micrometer. Okay, every car has a discard limit on the rotors. So if it gets down to that limit, you measure it to the thousandths of an inch. You've got to inform the customer we got to dispose of this thing, because you see these vents in here. If it gets too thin, next thing you know, the brake rotor explodes, and you've got an unhappy customer if you're trying to push it too far. So that's the in and out of some of the things that we see highlights on cars. If anybody's got any questions on these things, they're welcome to call us or text us or email us. They can go on purelife.com and ask us questions if they want. But that's kind of the nuts and the bolts of some of the major systems on a car. Anyway, questions?
Well, I think time's up, so we will move on to the next segment. But again, if anybody has questions, feel free to go to FaceTime and check out purelife.com, the car guy, and submit your questions. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.